Regarding the Cuban Revolution and Chinese Civil War, the use of guerrilla warfare was primarily conducted to establish unified civilian opposition against a repressive government, as legal negotiations alone were unable to precipitate political change. In terms of effectiveness, the use of guerrilla warfare in these conflicts was unsuccessful in gaining ultimate victory due to lack of resources, but essential in initiating a conflict and its foundation for future conventional warfare.
In regards to the causes of each and uses for guerrilla warfare, the causes of the two conflicts are similar in that they were primarily fueled by collapses and instability in government systems. However, they are different in that the unrest in Cuba was due to foreign influence, while the unrest in the Chinese Civil War was due to problems within China. Cuba fell under the influence of Spain and the United States, and guerrilla warfare was used in an attempt to gain independence from these two nations and their influence on the country's government. However, in China, people rebelled against the increase in Japanese and Western influences and used guerrilla warfare to fight for a single government system to fulfill the power vacuum created after the collapse of the Qing dynasty.
In both the Cuban and Chinese conflicts, guerrilla warfare acted as a catalyst in organizing a revolution meant to undermine corrupt government systems that rejected opposition. In both countries, opposition was found among the working class, which was ill equipped in training and weaponry, and therefore unable to organize an effective military to successfully oppose that of the government. The tactics of guerrilla warfare, including speed, propaganda, tactical terrain, small yet significant attacks, and secrecy, among many others, were used by the revolutionaries to gain the support of the population against the government while minimizing their own casualties by avoiding open battle. In Cuba, Fidel Castro primarily used guerrilla warfare because it was the only sustainable method for the rebels to make progress against the government without their side being completely obliterated by Batista's superior forces. Fidel and his brother, with the help of Che Guevara, worked to overthrow the Batista dictatorship, which they accused of corruption and tyranny due to its facilitation of organized crime and its overall negligence of the population's general welfare. The guerrilla revolution became the only manner in which success was possible, as the Cuban courts rejected Castro's attempts at peaceful and constitutional arguments against the government. Also, because Castro's planned attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953 had failed and caused his exile, he and supporters relied on guerrilla tactics such as heavy propaganda and refuge in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they could not be attacked by the Batista military. These techniques were highly useful in spreading support for the rebel cause, while also protecting the rebels in the early stages of the revolution, when conventional warfare could not be carried out due to their lack of resources and unstable position. This also helped reduce Batista's popularity among the population, and the United States had even placed an embargo on the Cuban government and recalled its representative. Although the U.S. still supported Batista, the Cuban government was significantly weakened.
During the Chinese Civil War, the use of guerrilla warfare was primarily conducted to establish unified civilian opposition against the repressive government, as legal negotiations alone were unable to precipitate political change. The problem in China was that the Chinese Communist Party was inferior to the nationalists in both resources and manpower. Despite the uses of guerrilla warfare during both the Cuban Revolution and the Chinese Civil War, in both these cases, the ultimate victories were not obtained until the revolutionaries were able to finally sustain conventional warfare, which was enabled by first using guerrilla warfare to strain the enemy and solidify necessary support. As seen in the early stages of the Cuban Revolution, direct attacks against the government were highly unsuccessful in making progress. Both the July 26 movement by Castro in 1953 and the March 13th anti-communist student revolt against the presidential palace in Havana in 1957 resulted in significant destruction of the rebels. From the protection of the mountains and use of guerrilla tactics, however, Castro was able to successfully defeat small individual garrisons of Batista's army and execute Batista's followers, which resulted in Castro's control over the mountain range. This was also bolstered by the use of radio broadcasts to spread Castro's rebel propaganda. It was not until the rebels took the offensive and combined a number of guerrilla revolutionaries under the command of Che Guevara, Castro, Bosque, and several other rebel leaders that a victory was finally obtained. This combined force was able to directly attack and capture the city of Santa Clara in 1958, which caused Batista to flee, allowing the rebels easy access and control of the capital. As for China, Guerrilla warfare did contribute to communist victory over the nationalists, however, it was not the sole reason for their victory. Other strategic factors, such as corruption of the nationals and foreign intervention for the CCP, helped shift the war in favor of the Communist Party, also contributing to the fall of the nationalist regime. Mao effectively aligned guerrilla warfare with his national policy. Throughout the period of guerrilla warfare and the Chinese Civil War, Mao kept his political objectives in mind. According to Mao's On Guerrilla Warfare, without political goals, guerrilla warfare must fail. Mao's political objectives did coincide with the aspirations of the peasants and lower class, which is another characteristic that made guerrilla warfare in the Chinese Civil War a success. Additionally, the peasants had a better understanding of the terrain, which gave them the ability to defeat the nationals despite being the weaker force. Mao expresses his 3 phases to warfare in his On Guerrilla Warfare. The first phase, guerrillas first need to gain people's support through propaganda and attacks on the organs of the government. Second, the guerrilla forces must escalate attacks on government's military forces and vital institutions. And third, guerrilla warfare leads to conventional warfare in order to seize cities, overthrow the government, and seize control of the country to achieve full victory. Therefore, Mao recognized the fact that conventional warfare is necessary to achieve true victory and control over the country. Toward the end of the Chinese Civil War, the war did shift to forms of conventional warfare. It was only at this time when the Chinese Communist Party was able to achieve military superiority, which suggested that guerrilla warfare was unessential in their overall gain in power. He was able to use guerrilla tactics to prolong a full-out conventional war in order to consolidate his forces while weakening those of the nationalists through mobilization and support from the peasants. Overall, guerrilla warfare is used to initiate a revolution against corrupted government when peaceful or traditional means are impossible to sustain. Guerrilla warfare itself is highly efficient in drawing support and damaging specific aspects of the enemy. However, conventional warfare is needed to secure an ultimate victory to conclude the conflict.